thing we have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we burn, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, "The Constitution of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that it is their right and duty to be at all times armed, that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press."
Welcome to WallBuilders Live. It is Thursday, meaning it's Foundations of Freedom Thursday, with a special emphasis on our Constitution, our Declaration, and our founding principles. Not that we don't talk about those throughout the week, but Thursday's kind of a special day to zero in on those things. And you can get some of our past programs for Thursday on our website in the archive section. Just visit wallbuilderslive.com, and you can get months and months of programs throughout the week. You can get those Foundations programs, Good News Fridays programs, and all kinds of great interviews as well. And speaking of our website, we encourage you to email us there at radio@wallbuilders.com, radio@wallbuilders.com. If you've got a question you'd like to be covered, David, these questions just get better and better. I mean, people are digging in deep, and they're thinking of stuff I've never even thought of that we need to be considering in terms of our freedom.
Well, I love the questions because they have a good finesse to them. They're not, how do I want to say this? They're not off the wall, wacky kind of conspiratorial questions. They're coaching questions that have been thought through, and they actually have been thought through from some pretty cool constitutional analysis. And so I'm really loving this, just coming from citizens, and people are getting back into the documents, they're getting back into the thinking, they're understanding the role of government, the limited role, the constitutional jurisdictions, and from that we're getting some great questions. And I'm just like you, man. This is a lot of fun, and it's really encouraging to see where folks are. I mean, we've got a number of questions from young people as well, and they're really intelligent questions. And this is just a good indication of where the nation's moving in the right direction. Hadn't necessarily worked up to the top yet, but we always get healthy from the bottom up, not from the top down. And so this is a good indication.
Well, you mentioned authority and jurisdiction. A lot of our questions in the past, a lot of our topics in the past have dealt with federal jurisdiction versus state jurisdiction. We've actually got an interesting question today that has to do with state jurisdiction versus another state's jurisdiction. It has to do with this young gal up in Massachusetts, kidnapped by the state there, Justino, who we've done several programs on. And the family was actually from Connecticut. And so one of our listeners asked something that has been asked quite a bit, and I think something we ought to get an answer on, and it's from Terry Wharton. It says, "I heard your broadcast about the young lady. I have a question. Why does Massachusetts have jurisdiction over a Connecticut family? The Connecticut family was only there in Massachusetts for medical attention. I just don't understand. Thanks for answering my question." Well, you're right, Terry. I don't understand either. David, why does Massachusetts have authority over this family from Connecticut?
Now, I'm going to give an example here, and don't consider this a parallel example. It's just an example to show how this works. We're sitting here in Texas. Let's say somebody out of Oklahoma comes down, crosses the Red River, comes into Texas, and they hold up a convenience store in Texas. We're not going to say, "Hey, Texas doesn't have jurisdiction over you. Go back to Oklahoma and let's see if we can get the police there to prosecute you." We're going to arrest you. We're going to hold you. We're going to prosecute you here in Texas because you broke a law, and you broke a law here in Texas. The same way, my car is registered in Texas, but if I drive to Missouri and speed, I'm going to get a speeding ticket in Missouri even though my car is registered in Texas. I'm a visitor in Missouri, so how do the state police there have any authority over me because I broke a law there? That's what happened in this case. Now, of course, you and I and lots of the rest of the nation contend there was no law broken, but what happens is this young girl is under the care of Tufts Medical Center. Tufts then sends her to Boston Children's Hospital to get some care there. When she is checked in the hospital, well, I got to be careful how I describe them. There's some adjectives I'd love to use. The hospital personnel, they're looking and says, "Oh, this is child abuse. Treating this child this way. You're doing exactly what the doctors say, but that's child abuse. We've got to report this as child abuse." And when they do, then the state child abuse authority, the DCF, comes in and takes the child away from the parents because they're saying child abuse. Wait a minute, how are you doing child abuse when you're doing exactly the regimen that your doctors have told you to do? Well, it's because this doctor doesn't agree with the other doctors. And so
in their mind, they were actually thinking this would be the same. Okay, if a Connecticut family travels to Massachusetts and you got a parent literally, abusing a child, physically abusing a child.
That's right.
Then the Massachusetts authorities absolutely have the right to take that child in and prosecute that parent. And so they were misapplying that principle.
That's right.
Of stopping a crime like that to this medical situation because they thought that it was abuse. Well, wrongly, of course, but they thought that this was abuse of a child.
Yeah, you and I say that they're misapplying. They would argue vehemently that they're accurately applying the law, which is why they did it. Now, of course,
and why it took so long in terms of a legal battle.
And that's why it's still taking so long. I mean, it's not over yet, and good for Matt Staver. We've had him on several times, but he is individually going after some of these guys who did this to this girl. They're not just getting the girl back and getting it back in the family. They're going to make some people pay on this so that for the next 10 years, anybody in DCF is going to think twice before they go kidnap a girl and say, here's what we want to do with this girl. So I applaud Matt for doing this. They got to be held accountable. This is a subject for a different day, but as you're well aware, government officials have immunity. You can't sue a government official unless the government gives you the permission to sue that government official. So that's a really bad deal where these guys aren't accountable. But Matt has certain ways that he can go after this and try to frame this in such a way to hold these guys liable and accountable and bring them up on malpractice charges as well. And so some of that's yet to come. So this thing may be going for the next several years, but I think there will be some scalps hung up over this. And I think it's going to scare some people straight, which it needs to, because bureaucrats should not be unaccountable. But what happened with this Connecticut family coming over, they're seeking the best for their girl. A bunch of bureaucrats who know better than parents, or at least believe they do, say, no, you're abusing your daughter. We've got to take her away from you. And that's why they did what they did in Massachusetts, even though it's a Connecticut family. In their minds, what happened was a crime. But it was not a crime, not by any way, shape, fashion, or form. By the way, Now that Justine is back out from under the care of DCF, she's actually improving in health again. 14 months they held her captive. Her health was absolutely destroyed. Now that she's out from under the care of the Massachusetts officials, her health is recovering very rapidly. She got to go out recently and do some outdoor activities she hadn't been able to do since DCF took her. So it's moving the right direction, but that's the answer to the question of why Massachusetts took authority over Connecticut family.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Matt Staver in the battle there. It's so important to hold those officials accountable for what they did, because if you don't put some fear in those officials to not misapply these laws, what you're going to have is fear in parents, and they're going to be afraid to go get medical care across state lines that their kids need for fear of ending up in a situation like that. And we don't want that either. But, man, it does make you think. You better know where you're going and where you're taking your kids, and you don't want to end up in a situation like that. So hopefully Matt can hold those guys accountable and get the system straightened out. So we got to take a quick break. We got some more questions from you in our audience. Stay with us here on WallBuilders Live.
Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief by the chains of the Constitution."
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Today, numerous court decisions demonstrate that there's often a conflict between the courts, the law, and religion. Has this conflict always existed? Not according to James Wilson. James Wilson was a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He was a law professor as well as an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. James Wilson saw no conflict between religion and the law. In fact, just the contrary. He declared, "Human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine." Far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters, friends, and mutual assistants. Indeed, these two sciences run into each other. In the views of Founding Father James Wilson, religion and good civil law were inseparable.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other."
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live, Foundations of Freedom Thursday. Thanks for staying with us. We got another question from you and our audience. This one comes from Jonathan. He says, "What do you think about modifying the Electoral College, such that electoral votes are tallied by county or district versus state. I live in the faithful blue state of Washington, where our state's electoral votes are determined based on the leaning of just one or two major counties in the Seattle and Tacoma urban areas. As such, candidates never spend any time here campaigning, and I feel like a county or district-based electoral college would prevent these scenarios where parties focus solely on battleground states and are forced to spread their campaigns nationwide. David, question basically saying, instead of winner-take-all states across the country for the Electoral College, what if it was determined more by congressional district? And I guess you'd still get, you still get two electoral votes if you won the whole state for those two senators, but you could split that congressional delegation. Two states do this now. What's your thoughts on that? Good, bad, indifferent, or on the fence? Where are you?
It's what the Founding Fathers are concerned about, that population takes over all the people. In their day of 13 colonies, 3 colonies had more population than the other 10. And so they were really concerned that there'd be a way to balance that out so that everyone gets representation. That's why they did the Electoral College. That's why you don't do majority wins. You have to have a large, sizable percentage of the vote and a large geographic distribution. The way we do it with winner take all, you're saying we don't care the distribution of the vote. So as they point out, and they're saying that they're not represented in their blue state of Washington, that's probably because they live on the east side of the Cascades. They're probably over in Yakima or Clarkston, or they're probably over in one of the cities, Spokane, on the other side. Because in the state of Washington, the city of Seattle-Tacoma, that joint city, takes 55% of the state's population. So the other 45% is probably more conservative than Oklahoma, Utah, and Texas put together, but they get no representation because the winner takes all in that state. And so by doing it by district, you're able to say, hey, there are other people in the state, and we do too have a voice. Same thing with Illinois. You look at Illinois, it's driven by Cook County, Chicago. But all those guys down toward Frankfort and southern Illinois, they are really conservative, but they get no voice. The same when you go to New York. New York City drives New York State. So who cares if you live in Albany or Rochester or anywhere else? New York City is your voice. So this is a good deal. If folks want to go to our archives, they will hear a program from Ken Blackwell that we deal with this expressly. There's a proposal out to get rid of the winner-take-all system and let it be by congressional districts. Therefore, you do get better representation of what people actually believe and think, and it's a better way to disperse the vote. So go to the archives and go to that program for Ken Blackwell, and it'll explain this in detail.
And just to clarify, we're not at all for getting rid of the Electoral College. This simply changes how an individual state awards the votes that they get in the Electoral College, and it doesn't require a constitutional amendment. You don't have to change every state. You can, a state makes this decision, right? The legislature actually makes the decision.
That's right. It is a state legislature that makes the decision, and it would significantly change the way elections go right now, because if you do it on the urban areas, there's more population in 9 states of the United States than there is in the other 41 states. So if you have the winner take all you got to do is win 9 states big, and you've got the whole thing. And that's what the Founding Fathers did not want. So we're not supporting the abolition of the Electoral College by any way, shape, fashion, or form. We're trying to do what they wanted to do with the Electoral College, and that is require geographic distribution as well as population distribution.
Got to take a quick break. We'll be right back with another question from you in the audience here on WallBuilders Live.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. How should we respond if confronted with frustration and conflict? The proper response was given over 200 years ago in a lengthy speech when Benjamin Franklin told the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, "In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? Have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need His assistance? God governs in the affairs of men. I therefore move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business." Benjamin Franklin knew that prayer was the proper response.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
President Calvin Coolidge said, "The more I study the Constitution, the more I realize that no other document devised by the hand of man has brought so much progress and happiness to humanity. To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race."
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live. I was just thinking as a kid there was quoting Calvin Coolidge. David, you mentioned recently, I never thought much about Calvin Coolidge. I heard you saying recently we were doing a recording, he was actually one of the better presidents.
Yeah, he was. He was one of the guys who probably understood the Founding Fathers better than anyone else that I've seen. Ronald Reagan had a great sense of understanding of history and original intent. Calvin Coolidge may be the best. Well, I'm sure. Now, I have to take that back. I think James Madison was really good. I think Thomas Jefferson understood original intent. I think John Adams and George Washington did. But once you get past about 1850, probably nobody understood original intent better than Calvin Coolidge and understood constitutional limited government better than he did. Coolidge is a really, really great president.
Well, speaking of limited government, another question from our audience. Joe Shoemaker asked, if the federal government has only a few responsibilities, why do we have legislators going up there constantly making one law after another? Why not tell them to stay home and leave us alone? I guess what I'm saying is I don't really understand their purpose. If they have no right to step beyond the limited boundaries of the Constitution, what are they there for? And maybe part of what Joe's asking there, David, is why are they there so much? You know, they're there throughout the year, and man, they're making laws left and right that are outside the boundaries of what they're supposed to be doing.
Well, but there's also an aspect here that there is a lot of stuff that constitutionally they're supposed to do. There are 15 specific powers given them in the Constitution originally. Over the next 17 amendments that were added after the Bill of Rights, they were given 2 additional powers. So the powers of Congress, there's 17 powers that they're given. And even though we talk about limited government, that doesn't mean it's a small government. Limited and small are not the same thing. For example, just as an example, the Constitution gives Congress, gives the federal government the right to come up with a military that can secure safety for Americans. And as Thomas Jefferson said, that's supposed to be for Americans wherever they go, anywhere in the world. And so the Founding Fathers found out after the Muslim attacks back in the early 1800s that, hey, we're not able to defend our American citizens over in the Mediterranean region with those northern African Muslim nations that keep attacking us. We got to have a military big enough to go over there and take care of our citizens. And so to have a military that can defend Americans anywhere in the world is not a small task. And just in the last few weeks, Congress has been going through the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, whereby they fund what the military needs. That by itself is a several-month-long process because you're talking about a whole bunch of things that we do military, and they're all constitutionally fine. In the same way, the Constitution also stipulates that we have that the president and federal government, they have the authority to make treaties with foreign nations to appoint ambassadors. Well, there's 195 nations in the world. So having ambassadors to 195 nations, dealing with American interests in 195 nations, or 194, not counting our own, setting up embassies there so that there are places that Americans in every nation can go, having a State Department to administer that, that's no small thing. I mean, the world is a big place, and to be able to protect and give services to Americans in all those countries is a big deal. And quite frankly, the same thing, the Constitution says that Congress shall have the power to establish post offices and post roads. Well, that currently means more than 31,000 post offices because you got one in every community. So if you go through just the 17 powers that the federal government has, you're going to spend probably months in Washington, D.C. because we got 330 million people in the nation. The problem is when they go there and do things that aren't in those 17 powers, when they start getting into education, when they start getting into transportation, when they start getting into energy, when they start getting into agriculture, that's where you get the grief. So, I mean, there's a lot for Congress. If we got Congress back to just the 17 powers, they would still probably be there 6, 7, 8, 9 months a year. Because
still plenty of real work to do.
There's plenty of real work to do. So, you know, that's part of the answer to that is they're going to have a lot to do. The problem is it should only be 17 areas where they work and do things.
But they have to understand jurisdictions, and for them to understand proper jurisdictions and true limited government, we the people have to understand that first because they will reflect what we believe and what we send. Quick break. We'll come back and talk more about it. Stay with us here on Foundations of Freedom Thursday on WallBuilders Live.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
Hey, this is Tim Barton with WallBuilders. And as you've had the opportunity to listen to WallBuilders Live, you've probably heard the wealth of information about our nation, about our spiritual heritage, about the religious liberties, about all the things that makes America exceptional. And you might be thinking, as incredible as this information is, I wish there was a way that I could get one of the WallBuilders guys to come to my area and share with my group, whether it be a church, whether it be a Christian school or public school or some political event or activity. If you're interested in having a WallBuilder speaker come to your area, you can get on our website at www.wallbuilders.com, and there's a tab for scheduling. And if you'll click on that tab, you'll notice there's a list of information from speakers' bios to events that are already going on, and there's a section where you can request an event to bring this information about who we are, where we came from, our religious liberties and freedoms. Go to the WallBuilders website and bring a speaker to your area.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution."
What a great quote to bring us back in here on WallBuilders Live, Foundations of Freedom Thursday, binding down man with the chains of the Constitution. David, you mentioned in the last segment those 15 enumerated powers in the original Constitution, and another 2 that came with the amendments that came after the Bill of Rights. So those are really the change then, right? I mean, that lists the specific things that they can do.
Let me go down that list and imagine that you're a legislator and you have to deal with all the complexities of these 17 areas. So here you go. These are clauses right out of the Constitution. Congress shall have the power, it's got the power to raise revenue to pay off debt, to protect the nation, and to fulfill the obligations established in the enumerated powers. So it's got the power to do all the things in those 17, but not the least of which is to raise revenue to pay off debt. Now, that in itself is a pretty good project when you've got a 17 trillion debt. Second, you have the authority to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Hopefully you borrow as little as possible. Third, you are charged with protecting the free enterprise system and ensuring the free flow of commerce. Fourth, you're to establish immigration laws and processes. Fifth, you're to establish the bankruptcy laws and processes. Sixth, you're to establish national currency, monitor supply and value, and punish counterfeiters of that currency. Seventh, you're to establish post offices and post roads. Eighth, you're to protect the private property of inventors, authors, and artists. Ninth, if so wishes, Congress can create and regulate federal courts, and it does. I think there's just under 1,000 courts, so that'll keep you busy. And I wish they would regulate those courts a whole lot more than they do. That'd really keep you busy if you do that. I'd support you staying there 12 months out of the year if you'd regulate the courts and get them under control.
That's right.
The 10th power is you have the power to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nations. 11, the Constitution says you can declare a war, you can grant letters of marque and reprisal, you can make rules concerning captures on land and water. 12 is you provide for and make rules for a national military. 13, you call forth and you train the state militia for national needs. 14, you oversee and manage all federal property, and they need to get rid of a bunch of federal property, but what they can oversee and manage specifically is Washington, D.C., the 10-mile square piece there, the bases, the federal buildings, etc. So that's a pretty good task in itself. And then the 15th power says to make all laws which will be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So making laws to make sure those previous 14 things happen, that'll keep you busy. 16th power is prevent slavery, and the 17th power is to prevent states from violating constitutional freedoms. So those are your 17 powers, and that'll keep you pretty busy all by itself.
That's still plenty. That's still plenty to do.
Now,
and all of those are legitimate. We would want the federal government doing each of those things.
But what is not there is you didn't hear anything about agriculture. You didn't hear anything about education, transportation, or the EPA or anything else. And that's what we don't want them doing. And I think really that's really, I think the heart of the question was, why are they going there doing all the stuff they shouldn't do? But if they would go there and do the stuff they should do, and you know, again, if they would just control the courts, that would take them a long time to get the courts under control, but they can do that. They have the authority to do that. Only the areas of what's called original jurisdiction can they not control the courts, and that's just a handful of areas. Other than that, they can completely define what happens at the courts and what issues the courts take up. And I wish they would be doing that and leave policy in the hands of legislators rather than the hands of unelected judges. So that's really a long answer to the short question, but those are the 17 powers that Congress has the constitutional authority to do.
Yeah, if we could just get them focused on it. But you know what you just did was you gave us a good checklist to when we're going to vote or we're sitting down with a candidate that's running for Congress or we're at a forum. Those are great questions to ask. I mean, here's the list. Are you willing to govern within this jurisdiction and not get outside these boundaries? Because that's what's going to get us back in, get the federal government back into its proper place, is us sending good people to Congress that will do that. And the only way that's going to happen is if we learn those things as well, which is why we're glad you listened today and that you'll listen more on Foundations of Freedom Thursday. It's an opportunity for us to dive further into the Constitution and the Declaration and our founding principles. Thanks for joining us here on WallBuilders Live.
Samuel Adams said, "The liberties of our country and the freedom of our civil constitution are worth defending against all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks."
We stand undivided, forever